So thanks so much for joining us for today's program and for being able to reschedule with us today. So today's program is uncovering and confronting our history, slavery, and race at Colonial King's Chapel. So as shared in the description for today's talk, this is the first part in a series of programs during which we'll be exploring and grappling with New England's difficult history with slavery and race as seen at King's Chapel, and considering the lasting implications of these histories in not only our institution, but in society today. So when we talk about the history of slavery in King's Chapel, we're not looking at an isolated and unique situation to this organization's history, but rather really at a microcosm of colonial New England. So while this series of programs will dive deep into historical episodes at King's Chapel, this site's history is part of a broader yet still overlooked national history. The institution of slavery played an integral role in the founding, physical and economic growth and wealth of not only colonial Boston, but the entirety of the American colonies in the United States. So a quotation you'll often see in discussions of the importance of studying and addressing the history of slavery in the United States comes from a spoken word artist and educator named Reggie Gibson, who says, quote, "Our problem as Americans is we actually hate history. What we love is nostalgia." I think this is pretty powerfully stated, but what does it mean? To me, I see it as American history is too often wrapped up in a series of national and patriotic narratives that overlook the violence and trauma that are deeply woven into this nation's history. Rather than experience the discomfort and disorientation of grappling with these difficult histories, US history is often viewed through rose-tinted glasses and stresses themes of freedom, equality, and progress, and relegating histories that challenge these narratives to the shadows. Yet we're keenly aware of the injustices, inequities, and violence that permeates through contemporary society. So how are we able to address these contemporary issues and build a more just future if we're unable to really identify the root causes in our history? How can we work to dismantle systems of oppression without understanding how they were constructed and maintained throughout our history? And expanding upon this quotation, I also want to turn to how it's been interpreted by the Southern Poverty Law Center as its writers for their Teaching Hard History project dove into kind of their interpretation of Reggie Gibson's words in a really well put way, I think. So this is profoundly troubling because American slavery is the key to understanding the complexity of our past. How can we fully comprehend the original intent of the Bill of Rights without acknowledging that its author, James Madison, enslaved other people? How can we understand that foundational document without understanding that its author was well-versed not only in the writings of Greek philosophers and Enlightenment thinkers, but also in Virginia's slave code? How can we ignore the influence of that code, that Bill of Rights denied, which withheld from African Americans the very same civil liberties that Madison sought to safeguard for white people? They continue on, quote, "Understanding American slavery is vital to understanding the racial inequality today. The formal and informal barriers to equal rights erected after emancipation, which define the parameters of the color line for more than a century, were built on a foundation constructed during slavery. Our narrow understanding of that institution, however, prevents us from seeing this long legacy and leads policymakers to try to fix people instead of addressing the historically rooted causes of their problems." And while uncovering and confronting our history as members of community like King's Chapel or inhabitants of a country built on enslaved labor is just a small step. It is a crucial step in really starting to understand how we got where we are and where to go from here. I know this has been kind of a bit of a long introduction, but it is, again, I think, important groundwork and context for why this topic is so important to dive into. And so for the rest of today's program, I'll be sharing an overview of the history of enslavement at Colonial King's Chapel and discussing the research process that led to identifying the names of at least 219 individuals who were either enslaved by a member of the church community or were baptized or buried at King's Chapel. So slavery in New England and in Boston dates back to the earliest days of European colonization. There are glimpses of this dark history, even in those often nostalgic and oversimplified stories of American history. Recall, for instance, that when the Pilgrims arrived in what is now Plymouth in 1620, they encountered Pisquantum, a Patuxet man who just so happened to speak English and was able to communicate with the English colonizers. Yet the only reason he knew English was that he had been captured during an earlier English voyage to the region and sold into slavery in Spain, before ultimately making his way back across the Atlantic, only to discover that his community had been decimated by diseases spread by Europeans to his indigenous population. While Massachusetts became the first state to abolish slavery in the 1780s, it had earlier become the first English colony in America to legalize slavery through its 1641 legal code, known as the Bodies of Liberty, which included the statement you see on your screen, which says, quote, "There shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity among us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, or such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us." So it begins, although it begins with what looks like it could be a denouncement of slavery, the Body of Liberties instead continues to list the many ways in which legal slavery may exist in the colony, including purchasing enslaved people from elsewhere. As one of the founders of Boston, John Winthrop wished, Boston really did become that city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, as he famously wrote. The Body of Liberties legalized slavery in colonial Massachusetts and established the first of many laws that justified over 200 years of legal enslavement in the American colonies and the United States. Under the institution of American chattel slavery, enslaved people were viewed as the personal property of their enslavers. As we'll see further on, individuals who were enslaved are listed in probate inventories or they're listed the enslavers' possessions and livestock, which is an eye-opening reminder of the cruel system present throughout much of American history. So by the time King's Chapel was established in 1686, slavery was already, as I said, a well-established institution throughout the New England colonies and was again responsible for their economic growth and expansion. So Boston, along with Newport, Rhode Island, quickly became a major port in the colonial American slave trade, which spanned across what is now often referred to as the Atlantic world, which our second program in the series will discuss in further detail. The trade of enslaved people and goods produced by their labor generated the wealth that enabled the colonies to expand. By 1686, the year that King's Chapel was founded, 80% of tonnage traded by merchant ships in the West Indies was registered in New England, and over a third of those ships hailed from Boston. By the 1740s, which was the peak of the transatlantic slave trade in Boston, this is the same decade when King's Chapel's members were raising funds to construct the current King's Chapel building. And at that time, enslaved people made up about 10% of Boston's population, and about 1 in 5 white families in the city were enslavers. The trade of enslaved people and goods produced by enslaved labor, which included rum, sugar, cocoa, mahogany, and more, fueled the colonial economy. The wealth of the colonies blossomed into the wealth of the United States. And though times changed and industry evolved, in the early years of our country, slavery continued to fuel its territorial expansion and wealth. This wealth, in turn, built many of the historic institutions that call Boston home to its day, and King's Chapel is among those places. So this is an important part of the background of Boston in which King's Chapel was founded and grew in its early decades. Before moving forward, I'll just add that although I'll be providing quotations from these historic documents in full, I'll be skipping over certain words with harmful histories. The first explicit reference to people of color at King's Chapel was in 1701, so 15 years after the congregation was founded in 1686. At a July meeting of the Wardens and Vestry, the sexton's duties were determined. It was ordered that, among other duties like sweeping and ringing the bell, quote, Clark Hill shall go and appease the boys and any disorderly persons. While this record does not explicitly reference enslaved people, the majority of Black Bostonians at this time were enslaved by white Bostonians of various social standings. Similar votes appear year after year, including 1736, which you see on your screen here, 1737, 1739, 1740, 1741, and so on. In 1741, King's Chapel's community began raising money to construct the current building, as I mentioned, and a significant amount of that funding was derived from slavery. Wealthy Bostonian Peter Faneuil, who is depicted on your screen, was selected as treasurer for collecting money towards a new building that year. As has become widely known through current debates in the city about renaming Faneuil Hall, its namesake, Peter Faneuil, was both an enslaver and derived his wealth from the slave trade. At the time of his death in 1743, he enslaved 5 people of color. Fundraising stalled for the church's building until 1747, when a new treasurer was appointed. The Faneuils were not the only enslavers and slave traders who funded King's Chapel. Colonial Governor William Shirley, who was the largest single contributor towards construction, enslaved several people in his home. Charles Apthorpe, one of the largest slave traders in the state or colony, and Isaac Royal Jr., the largest enslaver in Massachusetts, both contributed to the chapel's construction and worship in its pews. Throughout the 18th century, the royal family enslaved at least 69 people on their 500-acre farm in Medford, Massachusetts, and on their property in Antigua. The people enslaved on the royal farm in Medford were engaged in a variety of labor during their enslavement, including growing crops, raising livestock, producing wool and cider, cooking, and performing housework and domestic duties within the mansion. As I mentioned, at least 40% of the chapel's funding can be directly linked to enslavers and slave traders, and at least 68% for funding of the building came from those whose livelihood depended on slavery, including merchants who sold goods produced by enslaved labor, rum distillers who depended on sugar harvested by enslaved men and women on plantations in the Caribbean, and those who worked in the shipping industry itself. And enslavement was not limited to the wealthiest upper classes of Bostonians and church members. Laborers and craftsmen also enslaved people in their homes and businesses. Unlike the Apthorpes or Royals, John Bach was not a wealthy landowner. However, he did own a rope walk and tar house, which he left to his son upon his death in 1775. Bach's will also gave his son the men he enslaved to work at his rope walk. Quote, "I give and devise to my son John all the right and title and interest to my 2 men, Hamilton and Tom, also my other man, London." This indicates that perhaps Hamilton, Tom, and London labored at Bach's rope walk or tar house, providing perhaps a small glimpse into their daily lives. John Bach also enslaved 2 other people that he did not leave to his son, Dinah and Pompey, who you can see on the probate inventory here. Likewise, Ambrose Vincent Sr., who was the father of a King's Chapel member who worked as a dyer, left an enslaved man and his tools of the trade to his wife in his 1724 will, which is on your screen. "I do hereby give and bequeath unto my well-beloved wife Sarah, my man named Antony, and all of my copper tools and utensils of dyeing and all the dye stuff to my trade of dyeing and belonging." Again, this specific listing of what Vincent viewed as tools of the trade implies that Antony was involved in the dyeing business. So Hamilton, London, Tom, and Antony likely all did much more specialized work than those enslaved by the Apthorpes and Royals due to the nature of their enslavers' work. So by the time that the church completed the stone chapel in 1744, during their first Warden's and Vestry meeting after the stone chapel opened that August, policies regulating the presence of people of color at King's Chapel became more explicit. Quote, "voted that no be admitted to sit and stand in any of the aisle during the time of divine service, but the sexton be directed to order them up into the gallery." This vote effectively segregated the church seating. Seating segregation, both by race and by class, would endure at King's Chapel and many other churches throughout New England throughout the 19th and even early 20th centuries. So throughout the first half of the 18th century, enslaved people regularly appeared in King's Chapel's records. The colonial baptismal, marriage, and burial registers share the names of 101 people of color, 54 of whom are explicitly named as enslaved, and only 8 of whom are described as free. King's Chapel is, again, not alone in this history. The majority of Anglican and congregational churches in Boston during this time share these histories. These church baptismal, marriage, and burial registers, perhaps ironically, hold the key to unlocking the stories of both free and enslaved people of color in King's Chapel's history, and served as the initial starting place for the research process that located the names of over 219 enslaved individuals connected to the church. These are people who attended services, whose baptisms, marriages, and burials were held at King's Chapel, and whose enslavers were members of the church. Likely other enslaved people remain unmentioned within the written history of King's Chapel, and their names at this time remain unknown. Even among those listed, the amount of information really varies. In some cases, an enslaved individual appears in multiple documents, but in many, a person is listed only once, and sometimes without a name. The limited documentation and the way in which their stories have been recorded show the difficulty of tracking down these histories and emphasize the necessity of actively and consciously seeking out more information about all those who are enslaved. Even uncovering a single name or mention of an individual speaks to their existence and history and the humanity that enslavement tried to deny them. Connections with slavery at King's Chapel and other colonial churches was not limited to congregants. Ministers and even religious institutions owned enslaved people and used differing interpretations of scripture as a strategy to justify a violent and seemingly hypocritical practice. For many centuries, Christian churches created moral justifications for the continuation of enslavement, ranging from defending slavery through interpretations of the Bible to the notion that enslavement and conversion would bring people closer to their Christian God. Churches across Christian denominations in the American colonies found justifications for upholding slavery while also practicing their faith. The Church of England was no exception to a faith that interpreted enslavement of other human beings as acceptable. In Boston, the 3 historically Anglican churches, so King's Chapel, Old North Church, and Trinity Church, all have records illustrating the presence of enslaved people within their churches. Additionally, many members of the congregations were enslavers or their businesses exploited enslaved labor. As I mentioned, even ministers of the church, including at King's Chapel, Reverend Faneuil Miles, who was minister from 1689 to 1728, and Reverend Henry Keener, who was minister from 1747 through 1776, enslaved Africans and Native Americans. At least 4 of the church's 18th century clergy were known to be enslavers. Although not all enslavers pressed Christianity onto those they enslaved, many churches in colonial Boston recorded baptisms of enslaved men, women, and children. In order to prevent enslaved congregants from seeking freedom by virtue of baptismal rite, the Church of England created a modified rite for those enslaved, acknowledging the hypocrisy of enslavement within their faith. And I provided this on the screen here. Quote, "I declare in the presence of God and before this congregation that I do not ask for holy baptism out of any design to free myself from the duty and obedience I owe to my master while I live, but merely for the good of my soul and partake of the grace and blessings promised to the members of the Church of Christ." As an enslaved Anglican, an individual was forced to accept that although baptism freed their soul, their bodies remained in bondage. Even as members of the church, enslaved individuals, as I mentioned, were segregated from participating fully in service. They were relegated to the galleries, which were more often susceptible to intense weather and had poor views of the service. Even free men and women of color had to attend services in these segregated locations. As I move forward into some of the stories of individuals we've learned about through researching slavery and race at Colonial King's Chapel, I'll be sharing images of primary sources where possible and pointing out some of the research process that went into this work. So the first entry of a person of color at King's Chapel is the baptism of a baby girl named Martha, who was baptized on August 20th, 1714. You'll see on the section where I pulled out the entry, the record lists her parents as Joseph and Teresa, but we don't learn if Martha and her family were free or enslaved. The first entry we see for an enslaved person, explicitly stated, follows in September of 1720, when a man named Richard was baptized. Richard here is listed as enslaved by Mr. Faneuil, most likely Peter Faneuil, again, the namesake of Faneuil Hall. And the terminology at the time was to refer to them as servants. So when you see that in the burial registers, that's an indication that a person was enslaved. So slavery in colonial America, and thus at King's Chapel, was not limited to people of African descent, but as I mentioned much earlier, also included Native Americans. So one instance of that is Toby, a Native American man enslaved by King's Chapel's minister, Samuel Miles, who actually escaped from slavery in 1711, alongside several other Native Americans. We learned a bit about Toby from an advertisement that Reverend Miles placed in a local paper called The Newsletter in search of Toby. This short text is enlightening about slavery in the 18th century for several reasons. It illustrates the crucial point, again, that slavery in America was not limited to people of African descent, but that the indigenous populations were also enslaved. Toby's story also illuminates the connections between the English colonies and the expanse of the slave trade throughout the Atlantic world. Described as a Caroline Indian man, we learn that Toby came to Boston from the Carolina colonies. In the first decade of the 18th century, Massachusetts Bay colonists purchased Yamasee Indian war captives shipped to Boston from the Carolinas. And it's possible that this is how Toby ended up in Boston. Toby is a powerful reminder, again, of the colonial slavery. Ooh, that's the same thing I said before, sorry. Toby's story of equal importance reveals his agency in taking back his life into his own hands through his escape from captivity, but his ultimate fate at this time is unknown. But Toby was not the only person enslaved by a member of this church whose story of resistance and freedom is now known. A young woman named Letitia also sought freedom by escaping a man who held her in bondage. Letitia was probably born in the 1720s, though it's unclear whether she was born in Boston or brought here from Western Africa or the Caribbean during the height of the colonial slave trade in Boston. As a young girl, she was enslaved by a member of King's Chapel named James Gordon, who owned Pew 1 in the wooden church and later was the owner of Pew 62 in the current building. She most likely labored in the Gordon household doing domestic work during her enslavement. We know from other church records that Gordon enslaved at least 8 people during his lifetime, many of whom were baptized at King's Chapel, although we don't have a baptismal record for Letitia. In the late 1730s, Letitia was sold to a man named John Wass. And in 1739, taking again her fate into her own hands, she escaped from Wass's home. The man who enslaved her placed the following advertisement in the Boston Gazette in March of 1739, which you'll see on your screen. Quote, absconded from her master John Wass of Boston, a girl named Letitia, formerly bought of Mr. James Gordon. Whoever shall take up the said and bring her to said Wass in the south end of Boston shall be satisfied for their trouble. It's unclear if Letitia was captured and returned to slavery at this point, but her name does not appear in John Wass's 1741 will, perhaps providing some hope that she may have successfully secured her freedom. James, a man enslaved in Cambridge by King's Chapel member Richard Lechmere, saw his freedom through the courts. Richard Lechmere, who was a owner of Pew 82 at King's Chapel, was another known slaveholder within the congregation. He's also the namesake for the Lechmere Tea Station. In addition to being a slaveholder and enslaver, Lechmere's work as a rum distiller linked him to the triangle trade. In 1769, James, with the legal aid of Jonathan Sewell, argued that Massachusetts Colonial Charter dictated that anyone born in the colonies was free. Before reaching trial, the case was resolved, and James was granted his freedom and £2 sterling. However, this was a small portion of the funding that he had sought to receive. Richard Lechmere was a loyalist and fled to Nova Scotia before settling in England with his family in 1776. But the court summons from James was held by the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, National Historic Site in Cambridge. And it's hard to read here, I know, so I've actually reproduced the text on the next slide, which I can read aloud. We command that you summon Richard Lechmere to Cambridge in our county of Middlesex, if he may be found in your precinct, to appear before our justices of our inferior court of common pleas, to be holden at Cambridge within our said country or county of Middlesex on the 3rd Tuesday of May current. Then and there in our said court to answer to James, a man of Cambridge, aforesaid laborer, in a plea of respite, for that the Richard on the 11th day of April, 1758, at Cambridge aforesaid, with a force and arms assaulted the said James, and took him and imprisoned and restrained him of his liberty, and held him in servitude from the same 11th day of April until the day of the date here, against the law of the land, and against the will of him, the said James, and other injuries the said Richard against the said James committed, against our peace, and to the damage of the said James, as he saith, the sum of £100, which shall then and there be made to appear, with other due damages. So as I said, when he was granted his freedom, when this case was settled, he received £2, but again, he requested 100, so that's interesting to look at. Very occasionally in my research, I found examples of a person enslaved by a member here being manumitted or freed in an enslaver's will. Phyllis is one example of this. So this is a baptismal record for Phyllis on October 30th, 1754. Her record in the baptismal register reads servant of Geoffrey Bedgood, again indicating that she was an enslaved woman. Geoffrey Bedgood was not actually a member of King's Chapel, but he had several enslaved people baptized by the church. And the baptismal sponsor here was John Bach. So I mentioned earlier, the owner of the rope walk in Tar House, who was a member of the church. Her birth and death years are unknown, but we do know from this record that Phyllis was an adult at the time that she was baptized. In his 1758 will, Bedgood set specific instructions regarding Phyllis's life after his death. And this is kind of the first page, which shows a little bit of that. So he instructs for the sale of all his personal and real estate, except for Devonshire and Phyllis. In his will, while Devonshire, the other person he enslaved, was given to his wife, he wrote, quote, "I give unto my woman Phyllis her freedom, and do hereby immediately offer my deceased charge and set her at liberty from all and every person, and persons whatsoever. And I do hereby enjoin that my nephew, Geoffrey Williams, to procure and give such security as by law is required in the manumission for the executor plays him. To ensure that his wishes were carried out, Bedgood added the stipulation that his nephew would not receive his inheritance until after he ensured Phyllis's freedom." But before securing her freedom, Phyllis attended Geoffrey Bedgood's funeral, not by choice, as she was still enslaved by the family at that point, until his estate was settled. This is a list of expenses related to the funeral, and some of these are very typical funeral expenses. So I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but carrying to the grave, gold rings and gloves are in here too, which are given out as traditional funeral favors to attendees, things like that. But it also includes ordering shoes and clothing for Devonshire and Phyllis. So this indicates that Phyllis wore this new outfit to what was hopefully her last obligation as an enslaved woman. Unfortunately, at this time, this is all we know about Phyllis, as the archival resources really dry up after the death of her enslaver. This is, again, an issue researchers come up against when researching enslaved people during this era. Given the marginalized status of Black women like Phyllis in the mid-18th century and low literacy rates among enslaved and free Black people in Boston, many times the only records that we're able to locate are from the perspective of white oppressors like Jeffrey Bedgood. And as we've seen, racist language in archival records ironically leads researchers to the ability to dig into the histories of women like Phyllis. Most enslaved people connected to the church, however, like Quaco, Nancy, and Waterford, remained enslaved when their enslaver passed away. Peter Rowe, who owned Pew 108 in the Wood Chapel, enslaved 3 people at the time of his death in 1751, and his will included the following: I will that Quaco, Nancy, and Waterford remain and continue in this family for the use of my wife, son, and daughter, and their children, and shall not either of them be sold or disposed of unless they any time or times misbehave themselves or grow a turbulent spirit. The precedent, however, set by freedom suits like the one James brought against Richard Lechmere in 1769 eventually set legal precedent for the Quock Walker case that effectively works to start the process of ending slavery in Massachusetts in 1783. The last enslaved person who appears explicitly on records at King's Chapel before the American Revolution was a 63-year-old man named Caesar, who passed away and had a burial service conducted by Reverend Henry Kaner in July of 1774. So the vital registers after the American Revolution explicitly identify 104 people as Black through 1850. And the majority of these records are dated between 1788, so following the return of kind of post-revolutionary close record keeping after James Freeman is ordained, and between 1806, which happens to be the year when Boston's first African meeting house is built, becoming the city's first church created by and for Black Bostonians. The Black community at King's Chapel in the late 18th and early 19th century is small but notable. I don't want to move too far beyond the colonial era due to the scope of today's presentation, but I would like to share an example of research we've been able to uncover about some of King's Chapel's Black congregants after the end of slavery in Massachusetts. And a strong example of this is Hannibal Allen, who was married at King's Chapel to Rhoda Hall in 1795. Building off of the names and dates that appear for Allen and Hall in the church's records, we were able to locate Allen in documentation relating to his life and death, records that spoke to him kind of in his own right, rather than a connection to an enslaver, as we saw with Phyllis. But you can see here too, these are pages from, on the left, the marriage records and the burial register. Particularly in the marriages, you can see really how explicitly race is listed for Black congregants. And that is something that kind of pops up throughout the research. But in addition to finding marriage and burial records at King's Chapel, I found Hannibal Allen in real estate records from the city of Boston, which you see here, which shares that he worked as a laborer, and he also owned a small house in Beacon Hill, that he was a member of a fraternal organization founded in 1796 called the African Society, along with several other Black men with connections to the church. So on the list here, other folks connected to King's Chapel include, Cato Mori is on here somewhere. Cato Mori is here. And there's also 2 men here, Cyrus and Derby, with connections to the Vassal family. So these are children of a couple who was enslaved by the vassals who have connections to King's Chapel as well. Interesting. We also found a number of probate records from the time of Hannibal Allen's death. So not, as we saw with Phyllis, records from her enslaver, but we find records from Hannibal Allen and his family themselves, which show not only glimpses into his life and property. For instance, on the right side, you can see some of his personal possessions. So we had sundries, which is kind of just everything else, cookingware, chairs, bedding. So we got an idea of kind of what he had in his home. But on the other page, we actually learned a little bit about his widow, who, from close reading, we find remarried within a couple of years of her husband's death by the time his estate was fully settled in 1804. So while this information about Hannibal Allen is the result of kernels of research uncovered, the seemingly small glimpses of information unearthed through researching enslaved people and race at King's Chapel are important to understanding the breadth of experiences in the church's history, as well as lifting up stories of people who have historically been relegated to the margins in American history, to the extent the role of slavery in building American history is still overlooked today. As I mentioned earlier, even the new knowledge of a name or reference to an enslaved person in the church's history can be a powerful step towards acknowledging the existence and dignity of individuals subjected to the trauma of enslavement in our organization and our nation's past. On the screen here, for instance, we see another painful reminder of the attempts of enslavers to deprive people of their humanity, listing the names of Scipio, Ben, Caesar, and Mimbo between ironware and bookcases among personal property held by King's Chapel's member Charles Apthorpe at the time of his death in 1758. So without acknowledging how deep the history of slavery runs throughout American history, we can't really adequately understand how we came to be where we are. In the next program in the series, Uncovering, Confronting Our History, which is on November 19th, we'll be exploring the topic of King's Chapel slavery in the Atlantic worlds and looking into kind of the lesser known histories of King's Chapel as a global community inextricably linked with the Atlantic slave trade, with members and supporters ranging from merchants deeply involved in Boston's maritime economy to owners of brutal sugar plantations throughout the Caribbean worked by enslaved laborers. That program will also explore the sources of wealth that contributed to the construction of this 1754 stone building in more detail than I did today. And I hope you'll join us then. Before we move on to open the floor for questions about today's topic, I'd like to encourage you to all take a moment to take a look at your screen and take in the names of the enslaved people connected to King's Chapel that we're aware of through our research at this time. So thank you. So I'll leave that up for